Joe Speak Podcast, Joe Richardson, attorney. We got a good one today. I always say we have a good one, but I mean it because we're guest driven and we've got good guests. Today we've got David Rabb, who brings a lot of different interesting experiences to the table, not only having a distinguished military career, but also being a DA in the domestic violence unit in San Bernardino County, and also being a distinguished public servant. Been on the city council in the city of Paris for many years, and that's the city where he's from. So we're going to talk about his perspective, not only in terms of his life, but how the things that he does, which to some may seem to be very different, how one informs the other. I think he has a very unique perspective, being in this geographic area, Riverside, San Bernardino County, being a man of color, being someone that really lives the life of being a public servant, not only in his day job, but in everything else he does. So we will chop it up and look it over about a lot of different things, like we always do. Got another good one today, Joe Speak Podcast. Let's go. Okay, we are back. Joe Speak Podcast, Joe Richardson. I am so pleased to have David Rabb today. You know, some people say Facebook is a bad thing, okay? However, when it exposes you to someone you would not know otherwise, and you get a sense for their virtue, what they hold dear and what's valuable to them, and you know that you connect with them, then Facebook or social media can be a good thing. And David Rabb, attorney, military veteran, and Paris City Council member, is one of these people that I did not meet before we connected on social media. And so I'm proud to know him and honored to have him as a guest today. So David Rabb, attorney, how you doing today, sir?
Doing well, Joe. How are you doing?
Good. I'm glad that you're here. Let's talk first. We got a lot of places to go because, you have done and are doing some very important and unique things. So why don't you start off by telling us a little bit? I always kind of build the house with my guests before we go into some things so that they know so that the audience knows that you're speaking from a standpoint of credibility and personal experience. So tell us a little bit about your background coming up in the area that you did, and then your education and career path.
Okay. Originally from Paris. I still live in Paris. My grandparents came out to Riverside County in 1940. Then the next year, my dad was born at the old Riverside General Hospital.
Wow.
And then I was born in the mid-'80s, the oldest of two children, my dad and my mother, and grew up in downtown Paris, attended Paris public schools from kindergarten all the way up through Paris High School, graduated in 2004. I was fortunate to attend Stanford University, where I attained my degree in political science, my bachelor's degree in political science, and then went straight through Stanford. I was there 7 years, an additional 3 years of law school, where I obtained my JD in 2011. During that time, I was also in the Navy Reserves, served as enlisted because I joined prior to getting my degree at Stanford. Right. And I kind of a different path than most people. I joined because I really wanted to get out and get life experiences beyond the university. So what happened was when I finished law school, I took the bar exam and then I deployed 1 week after that. So I'd been doing my reserve duty of drilling 1 week in a month, deployed for a year to the United Arab Emirates, came back as a sworn attorney at 25, 26, worked nonprofit, doing my own thing for a while. During this time, I really got involved in politics, and that was my interest. And I ran for Paris City Council in 2014, helped unseat two long-term incumbents that had been on there almost 20 years. I think one had been on 18 years, the other one had been on about 15 or 16 years.
Sure.
Started serving as a deputy district attorney shortly after that. So I have 5 years as a DA, and was reelected in this last election in 2018. And I think I got the highest vote count in an off-presidential year election in Paris City Council. So been on city council 6 years, been a DA a little over 5 years. As a DA, I work in the family violence unit, which is any domestic violence related type felony. These are the more serious DV felonies, someone that has a history of domestic violence or an individual that has inflicted substantial injuries on their cohabitant, spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, and that instance. So I've been pretty busy. I just turned 34 last month.
My word.
I think of myself as a young man, but I'm not as young as I used to be. So I keep myself busy doing all of that, along with going to the gym and doing projects around my house. My house is in downtown Paris, right around the corner from my dad's house, the house my dad's owned since 1964. He's 78 now and lives with my stepmother, literally like 2 houses down. So I'm fortunate to still live in the neighborhood that I grew up in. And 4 houses down from the site where my grandfather had his bungalow when he came here in 1940. They took a campsite. There was a place called Camp Hun where the cemetery is now, the National Cemetery. When the war ended, World War II ended, a lot of African Americans were able to get the bungalows and turn those into homes. So that was the site that my dad grew up on, 5 houses down from where I'm at right now.
Wow, that's incredible. So tell me about how being an African American male. Now, I'm going to make an admission here, which is terribly stupid of me. I was about 7 or 8 years old. We had some family members, some cousins of ours, who said, "We're going to move to Paris. You're in South Central LA. We're going to move to Paris." And I nudged my mom and I said, "Mom, why would they move to France?" And I didn't know that Paris was this community, which is like a lot of other communities, Moreno Valley and some others. My parents moved to Apple Valley eventually, up in the high desert where, and actually that was going to be my connected question as to whether or not your family was military connected, because I've seen a lot of people of color move into these areas because of a military connection. But tell me how your experience growing up, what you saw, and how it influenced you in terms of actually becoming a part of your local government.
Well, growing up, I grew up working class. My dad was a plumber. My mother was a housewife up until I was about 7 or 8. Then she worked as a maid for a little bit and then a church secretary. So solidly working class. I wouldn't say we were middle class. We weren't poor. Right. We would go on vacations, Disneyland, Knott's Berry Farm, Las Vegas, but we wouldn't go to Europe or go over to the East Coast. So never wanted anything, but never had those blinders off to see like some of the things that some of my colleagues at Stanford and some of the middle class people were doing. Grew up in downtown, so my house was pretty stable. My street was pretty stable. You had one street over we couldn't go on. That was considered the bad street, or 6th Street in Paris. Sure. So got to see a lot of things. Was sheltered in the sense that I grew up in a 2-parent stable household. Right. I don't remember my parents ever really getting into arguments or anything like that. Right. But growing up in Paris, I realized that there were a lot of things. And then going to Stanford and serving in the military, I realized that the city of Paris could do a lot more to serve their residents, particularly commercial, residential, social services. I think the previous elected officials, they saw things more in the old sense of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And I've always been a proponent of hard work. Right. But it seems like they had a 1960s kind of view on like if you worked hard, everything would come your way. Sure. And they kind of ignored the major societal changes that happened since the Reagan administration, where people are working more and more hours, but they're being able to not provide for themselves. So I saw what was happening, and I saw, I was 28 years old in 2014. And I said, hey, if I'm going to run, I need to run now. There's changes that need to be made. Sure. If I wait any longer, career, spouse, children, I don't have any of those yet in terms of spouse and children, but those would end up, filling a void in my life. But I decided to run then. Right. And I think those things, growing up working class, but not being kind of ensconced or secluded away from poorer people that had more struggles, and then going off to an area where you had elite people who were just upper middle class, the kids of doctors and lawyers, but the kids of princes, Saudi or princes, entertainers, multiple generations of wealth, seeing how they operated and seeing the things that my community lacked really sparked an interest in getting involved in politics in my local community.
Just incredible. And it's not a small thing to get elected to city council when you are on the young end. And so to have done that at that time and to be still doing it is quite incredible. So tell me about the process in terms of, how you decided to how you decided to go into the DA's office. And was that something that was always in your heart in terms of, practice of law? I know I want to do criminal law, whatever else. I had a career PD on recently that always knew, and we knew him for a long time. He always knew he wanted to do criminal law. So tell me how that process kind of happened for you.
I would say it's something that developed over the course of me growing up older and getting involved more in public service and learning the various laws that affect people. And it wasn't something I wish I could say it was something I was dead set on through undergrad and through law school. After getting elected, I had applied a little bit earlier And then getting in, I really think the two jobs or two careers really help each other in terms of not only am I a DA that's actually implemented laws, not necessarily criminal laws, but ordinances in the city, municipal laws, and being a DA, dealing with laws, having to read laws on both ends, I think gives me a wide appreciation for how both jobs intersect. And it was something more I just grew into. Family violence is something that I realized that I actually enjoyed, and I enjoy as a male, one of the few male attorneys in that field.
Really?
It's kind of, I've been able to really create a bond with a lot of the, because most of the victims, to be honest with you, are female victims, male defendants. But we have same-sex defendants, male victims. I think my perspective on being around different groups of people throughout my life, coming from a working class community, going to an elite institution, serving in the military, having African-American father, Caucasian mother, growing up in a predominantly Latino community, I'm able to interact with a lot of people and see people's perspectives. Sometimes it gets tiring. You say, okay, why does this person keep going back to this? But you have to step out of your shoes and think of the things that are happening in their end. I think those two things have really meshed well. So to answer your question, it wasn't something that was dead set on through undergrad and law school. It's something more I developed an appreciation for. One, applying and then serving as a city councilman, and two, actually getting in there and doing the job. The longer I do it, the more I appreciate and like my service to the community in that end.
Right. Excellent. So I see a theme here for sure, which we'll talk about more, is that really there is a public service component in just about every aspect of your life. It looks like I use this show as an opportunity to educate people, and one of the things, frankly, that I'm concerned about right now, from a societal standpoint, is that we don't always do the work of nuance to understand that. There's some thoughts that need to be had about categories that we like to put each other in. And we do it for safety reasons. Like when we're young, the first lesson we learn, your parents tell you, don't talk to strangers. Now, later on, when you get a little bit older and you understand how to discern, now you can get a sense for who you can be around and who you can't, or whatever else. And the point that I'm making is this: I want you to talk about what you do, how you investigate cases, how a case becomes a case, because what I don't want to happen is that even though the discussions that we see out in society, we're talking about George Floyd, we're talking about, what should we be doing with the police? And I don't think defund's a very good word or the greatest concept. I would more say repurpose and that kind of thing. But I don't want DAs or people that do work that serves the community villainized. You know what I mean? Without us saying, here's what this organization, or this is what this group does. Maybe we'd like to do a little less of this or a little more of that. People are going to have their opinions. But as someone that's called has called the police on family members, I'm just going to keep it real. You know what I mean? And then there's have family members where you're like, listen, I would never want them to go to prison, but they know right from wrong and they've made a choice, or whatever the case may be. I know that you have to do the work of nuance when you're dealing with these issues. So talk to me about humanizing through, you guys process your investigation, what it is that you guys do, how an investigation becomes a case and that kind of thing.
Okay, so the first thing as a DA that we're always told, especially in San Bernardino County, is as DAs, we seek justice and equality. So justice can take many forms. Right. One, justice could mean reading a case and deciding not to file a case based on the offender or suspect's age, based on proof problems, based on other problems with maybe the investigating officers. Justice could mean giving a diversionary program where the person takes some classes and we dismiss the case. Justice more along the lines of some misdemeanors could mean work release, where the person works, 5 or 6 Saturdays, or a civil compromise and a vandalism where the individual doesn't have a criminal history. They pay the victim and then we dismiss the case. We usually do that with people with not an extensive record, right, and the vandalism is slight. Say an 18-year-old rear ends a car and then goes off and doesn't, he didn't know what he was doing, or it right, wasn't major damage. People weren't in the car. Right. Justice could also mean sending a person to county prison are state prison for multiple years. You know, you have people that have did wrong things, molested children, people that have murdered people, serial abusers, domestic violence abusers. In terms of my job in our office, in terms of how cases become from reports up into the case, as a family violence unit, we're assigned vertically to the cases, meaning we get the case from initiation through preliminary hearing, which is a short hearing to show cause to keep the person in custody or show that the case should continue on, all the way up to including trial. Now, to let you know, most cases do not go to trial. They resolve either plea bargain, or once in a while you might have to dismiss the case if there's witness issues, if there's proof issues, if there's issues with, you know, getting the available evidence. And other units, other general felony units are anything ranging from 10851, which is vehicle theft, all the way up to murder, depending on the circumstances. We typically have people that review the files, initiators. These are people, DAs that are either, or they might be older, they're more new experienced, they might want to break from taking cases to trial and appearing in court. They get stacks of police reports, they read the cases, they find the applicable charges based on the circumstances in the person's record. They issue it, and then they would give it to another deputy, conduct a preliminary hearing, and then after preliminary hearing is done, it goes to the actual trial deputy. That's how general felonies work in our county. So some of the things I look at when I file a case is I look at the injuries. So not every case I get is going to be a felony, depending on the injuries and the person's record. So it's a sliding scale. The injuries might not be extreme in this instance, but I open up the person's rap sheet and there's multiple arrests for domestic violence or multiple convictions for domestic violence. If the convictions or arrests are in our county, I'll try to see if I can get a feel for like what happened in the previous cases. We'll also figure out like how long the cases have been. If the person's 45 and their last case was in 2000 and the injuries are minor, that will probably be a misdemeanor. And then there are instances where there's no case filing at all. We look and it looks like it was a what's called mutual combat, where it's like both hands and somebody doesn't grab something and make it a higher level. We may decline to file that if both of the people don't have records. Say, you know, a basic shoving match between a husband and wife. And we also look if it's a husband that's been married or a wife that's been married 40, 50 years and it's one shove and there's no injuries and we don't have any indication that there's any prior history, that may be a decline to file, or it may be an instance where the individual takes classes and we dismiss the case. So it's a wide range of what happens. I think as a DA, we owe it to really review the reports and not to let biases come in. If we say, oh, this person's from San Bernardino, we're going to be more harsh to the person in Gatipa and Redlands. We have to put that aside and look at the person's in record and factor in how old this person is. Now, if the person has a bad record, they're say 45 years old, and they had a bad record from like the early to mid 90s and they've been clean all the way. That's 25 years. So we have to factor that in. So it's an extensive process. So we would initiate, say, for instance, a domestic violence case. We initiate the case, the request of discovery. Discovery's body cam, 911, additional police reports, previous cases. We would get ready, conduct the preliminary hearing. Preliminary hearing, the officer can come in and testify as to what the victim told the officer. If we have the time, we really like to bring the victim in to get a feel for whether or not they're cooperative, to see their status at, because a lot of times the preliminary hearing will be much closer to the time of the incident. So the incident happens in June. You do the prelim in late June, July, and then you might not go to trial until a year later, or with COVID happening, things are probably getting pushed a year and a half, 2 years later. So you want to lock in their testimony. So it's an extensive process. It may be confusing. And then you have a whole other layer, which are misdemeanors, cases that you cannot serve more than a year on. Those are most of your DUIs, your vandalisms under $400, your batteries, your 242s, where people get into a fight, but it's a simple fist fight, no broken bones, no extensive injuries. Those are our misdemeanor cases. So there's a whole nother consideration in dealing with those particular cases.
Interesting stuff. So now I want you to put on your legislator hat, and it might not necessarily be something that you always deal with as a city councilman, but something that you might deal with as a state legislator. And I'm not trying to start any stuff or anything, but I could personally see you as a state legislator. But put on that hat and tell me the things that you think would make your job easier, the things that make them harder now, from a legislative standpoint, and how we might be able, as a society, to help ourselves a little bit more legislatively in terms of maybe what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong.
Okay. I'm speaking now as a private citizen, as a Paris City councilman,
that's good.
who has who is informed in his role as a DA. So I'm not speaking on behalf of my office.
Right. Gotcha. Good.
I think the legislature, they wanted to make changes. I think in the 90s, there was a push for more incarceration, more tough on crime. And you can't just, demean all those people that were doing that in the 90s, because it really was bipartisan.
Sure.
And I think a lot of people forget how high crime rates were in the late 80s, early 90s.
Right.
I do think we did go too far on a lot of those particular measures.
Right.
And I think needs to be change. But I think at the same time, the state legislature is going in the opposite direction.
Right.
And I think certain members of the legislature are vilifying law enforcement,
Sure.
and vilifying DA's offices, when we have been making the change. If you look at what went on from 2000 or so to 2015, there were changes up and down the state DA's offices.
Right.
But I think the state legislators would do better if they actually consulted the district attorneys
Right.
that work in the office. And don't forget that a lot of these, it's not just the defendant. A lot of times we're protecting people in the community as a
Right.
domestic violence DA or family
Absolutely.
violence unit. What about all the African-American, Latina men and women who are victimized by
Sure.
these people? So
Sure.
I think it's, in terms of moving forward, I think they should really talk to the DA's office, start a conversation. For instance, they revised the felony murder rule, and they revised it so you either had to be the actual killer, a major participant, or an aider and abettor to be charged with felony murder, which
Right.
I think is in line with many other jurisdictions in the world.
Right.
My issue was that they made it retroactive, and they didn't
Mm.
provide extra funding for the DA's offices to go and review these cases. So you have DAs pulling boxes, cases 30, 40 years old,
Wow.
interviews on cassette tapes. And there really wasn't guidance on how to look at those old cases.
Right.
And since then, we've had case law saying, hey, you can rely on the record of conviction, meaning the jury trials transcripts, the appellate decisions. But there was a good 6 months where we thought we had to actually open up a whole new trial and bring witnesses in from the 80s and 90s.
Wow.
So I think
Wow.
in terms of that could have all been avoided by really sitting down and saying, okay, if we're going to make this retroactive, it's going to be more staff members, people going back on these cases, because, a lot of these cases, I had people that were judges that had just died or retired, and they were the DA, they were 25-year-old DAs in 1985. Now they're 60-year-old judges or retirees.
Sure.
So I think it's stuff like that where they really should not, I understand they just don't want to get our perspective,
Right.
but they really should factor us in, because I
Right.
think a lot of people, when they picture district attorneys, they picture people that are out to get minorities or out to
Right.
get black and brown men, but it's really not the case. You've had a lot of diversification over the last 25 years in all
Right.
these offices. And I
Right.
think we should really be brought into the discussion.
Right. Great. Let me build on that question, because you talked about the felony murder rule and how this change made some things retroactive. Talk to me a little bit about the idea of, retroactivity in general. And also, you've seen in some jurisdictions, I don't know if it's in ours, but you've seen in some jurisdictions, certain crimes where they have gotten rid of the statutes of limitation entirely. You know what I mean? Tell me about the balance of, you want to do justice, et cetera, but people are entitled to due process. Like for me, that, I'm not a criminal lawyer, not really, but, done very little criminal stuff, but, like a statute of limitations. I'm not coming from the standpoint of somebody that is, my family has been a victim of violent crime. I don't know if I ever told you, but my sister was killed in an unsolved murder 22 years ago in Inglewood. And so I understand having problems with the criminal justice system from the standpoint of not having the conclusion or whatever else. But at the same time, there's a part of me that says, oh my God, if the statute of limitations is forever, or there is no statute of limitations, what do we do, from a due process standpoint, and where does that go? So give me your thoughts a little bit about, how you balance those types of things, in terms of how we proceed, because I think that the danger that we have, and maybe we did get it wrong a bit when we, did what we did in the 90s, bipartisan, in terms of extending out, of being more punitive and that kind of thing. But if we do it from an emotional standpoint and we're not as thoughtful as we need to be, how do we balance that and make sure that things are as balanced and as fair and just as they can be? So my question was about, extending statutes of limitation, making things retroactive, some of these things that have the potential to have your defendant be more in limbo than otherwise.
Yeah, I think there you do have due process issues in terms of extending the statutes. And I think you have to factor in the alleged or accused person's rights to due process. And for instance, witnesses that may have been exculpatory, people that may have helped their case, may have died off over the 20 or 30 years that you're extending the statute. At the same time, when you're making things retroactive in terms of the felony murder rule, you're opening wounds for people that thought their cases had been resolved for the murders of their family members, rapes of their family members.
Sure.
For instance, I had a felony murder case, not going too much into the details of it, that happened in the mid 80s.
Right.
And the victim's daughter was about 25 years old when it happened. This woman is almost 60 years old.
Wow.
And she thought the defendant had been, we thought based on the case law before subsequent cases that had been issued, that the case might have been, not only was the guy would be let out, but the conviction would be vacated. And that was the big issue because he was 15 to life.
Right.
So he could have been paroled.
Right.
But just the fact that the whole entire conviction would be vacated
Sure.
really brought these 35-year-old, almost 35-year-old scars, almost opened them.
Sure.
And like I said earlier, I think it's just factoring in, one, the defendant's suspect's due process rights in terms of if it's 30, 40 years later, how many of the witnesses that may be exculpatory, how much of the evidence that may have helped their case has either disappeared, people die, people move, people lose contact in that period. And at the same time, how much of, in terms of moving forward and making things retroactive, you want to have some kind of finality toward judgment so that the victims and society can move on.
Right.
So I think it's something that the legislature is really going to have to bring all the parties to the table in terms of community leaders, public defenders, district attorney's offices, victim advocates, the California Compensation Board, in terms of how does vacating convictions deal with, victim restitution and things like that. So I don't think these things have been fully fleshed out.
Sure.
I think in terms of when the legislature moves forward, they move forward in terms of more who is the loudest activist, who is the most involved. And I think the average person doesn't have the time or the just the ability to follow through what's happening in the legislature in terms of propositions, for instance. We had 16 propositions in 2018.
Right.
That's a lot for the average. I mean, I'm a DA and a city councilman. It was hard for me to follow all of those, and I ultimately did. But
yeah, sure.
I think it's getting people more involved in the process of moving things forward.
Right. Good stuff. Let me ask you this. I mean, of course, we've talked a little bit about this before in terms of, one of my questions. I mean, unless somebody is under a tree somewhere, they're noticing that there is an interesting discussion going on in this country between COVID, between, George Floyd and all of these other things where we're talking about where we go forward as a society. We've got certain tensions and things like that. Talk to me a little bit about how those discussions affect your work, if at all. You've got to stay focused, what your goals are and those types of things. But, at the risk of asking a question that could be very broad, what are your thoughts about how that affects, your goals and what it is that you're doing? And is it any more difficult because of what it is that you're doing?
Yeah, I think first off, George Floyd was murdered. The cops should be held accountable. I'm glad they were all charged with murder. Right. Breonna Taylor's, the cops that murdered her should be charged. I don't know why they're messing around on that.
Right.
But I think at the same time, it makes my job harder. You see these instances, it makes people not trust law enforcement, not trust people who are moving forward and seeking justice in that sense. Mm-hmm. I think also the George Floyd situation and the attended protests really not only police brutality, it's more of systemic racism. It's not only the police that are brutalizing Black people, it's the teachers that are brutalizing Black children, particularly Black boys, the doctors that aren't giving the care for Black patients.
Sure.
So I think we really, as a society, we really need to have the third phase, the civil rights movement. Right. And I think a lot of people are like, why is this still going on? Well, it happened late May. We're only in middle of July. Right. The civil rights movement was a 14-year problem. I mean, if you look at from Brown v. Board to Martin Luther King's assassination, but if you go back further, the roots in the civil rights movement were even laid in the 1920s with a series of court decisions in the 20s and 30s. Right. I think it makes my job harder, but at the same time, we can move forward. There's certain things that we can do. And I think people in my office are having those discussions, and it will be released to the public in the future. I think it makes it harder because people are going to be less trusting of law enforcement, unfortunately. And let's be real, you can say you support the badge and Blue Lives Matter, and you can also say Black Lives Matter. I don't see the two as opposing.
Right.
You can support good police officers. You can support fully funding police agencies, and also support diversifying their tactics. Maybe augmenting their people with social workers, giving them training in de-escalation, giving them funding so that they all have body cams.
Right.
And yet, at the same time, you can say Black Lives Matter, point blank, period. I just do not see why we have to have this gray area in America. But I understand why people may be apprehensive to say Blue Lives Matter, apprehensive to the police in general. But I think we need to stop going on beyond this black and white, seeing issues like you mentioned earlier in black and white, and being more nuanced, moving forward, being more nuanced. We also have in the background, we have the whole COVID situation. So jury trials have been suspended. They're finishing up a few that were in process in March, but we continually getting orders. We were getting on track to start jury trials again with people socially distanced, jurors spaced out. But with the influx of new COVID cases, we have a new order extending the time frame for a lot of these trials to August. So not only do we have these issues at the national level happening, we have the issues at the state level and healthcare level of really making it difficult to do jury trials at the time and bring defendants in for their trials. So it's a lot of things happening right now. That are going to have repercussions.
Yeah, absolutely. This is great because I get to jump around because of your areas of expertise, man. We can do all kind of stuff. So you gave us a wonderful one-on-one on DAs and on the justice system and what you guys' process is. Now I would ask you to do something similar about city government. Everybody, everybody's got an opinion, but not everyone bases their opinion on fact. Okay. And so you are a city councilman where you have to deal with the realities of, hey, we're a city government. Here's where our money comes from. Here's what we're missing because of COVID. And here's what we have to do, because most city governments have to balance their budgets every year. So talk to me a little bit about the difficulty in that you're going to face, and that city governments in general will face. Another opportunity to educate because of what we're missing for COVID. And then, what might be some things that city governments need to think about for the future related to that.
So Paris, we were fortunate in that we have diverse revenue streams. So one is that we have point of sale distribution centers. And I know that's been a very hot topic in the Inland Empire.
Okay.
And one of the point of sales that we have, so a few of the point of sales we have is Wayfair and Home Depot. They sell all the patio furniture out of Home Depot. And point of sale means that we get a percentage of the sales tax revenue from the sales of Wayfair and Home Depot. Okay. So we were actually doing very well financially. We were able to pay off all of our pension debt January of this year, 2020.
Wow.
But we're still facing challenges with COVID because you have, fewer people are going out and spending money at our retail establishments, our Burlington, our Ross, because they were closed. And I think people have been tightening their belts over the last few weeks. I mean, if you're not going to work, you don't need to buy that new suit or that new tie. Your kids aren't going to school. You don't really need to buy new school clothes if they're going to be all virtual. Right. So we're seeing a decrease of revenue, and not so much as the other cities, because once again, we have the point of sale and online shopping is increased because throughout March and April, that's what people were doing, watching Netflix and buying things online. So we were fortunate in that end. But I think in the next, what's happened is in this municipal government is you're going to see the repercussions of COVID this next fiscal year. So this fiscal year starting July 1st, June 30th, we see the issues, we anticipate the issues, but the issues are really going to come to the forefront in county, state, and local governments next cycle. That's going to mean furloughs. It's going to mean a reconfiguration of staff, which we've already done in terms of people not coming in full capacity, especially this last month with the increase in cases. Right. And also you've seen a lot of retail stores close. This is like 2008 part 2. And we knew that a lot of these stores were going to close over the next few years. But I think how rapidly they've closed. JCPenney's, Sears, these were establishments that, in the 90s, and I'm sure in the 80s and beyond, these are places you would go and spend your money at. They're going to be gone. at the end of the next year. And so with fewer retail establishments, you're going to have a lot of vacant commercial land. I remember reading somewhere that America on average has 3 times as much commercial property as Great Britain.
Wow.
So we're going to have all this vacant property. I work in San Bernardino. You go down East Street,
sure,
all those empty stores.
Oh yeah.
Inland Center Mall is basically going to be, it's going to be Carousel Park too. So I think municipal leaders really need to start looking at repurposing those sites.
Sure.
And in the past, we would, put a church there, our social services office. Why not repurpose it, have mixed use retail?
Right.
You have a lot of people 18 to 25 that don't have the income to rent out an apartment, but don't want to live with their parents. Why not repurpose some of these malls or anchor stores to, this is just my idea in terms of like a dorm room setting for people that aren't going to college, might be working at Amazon. So they don't have to live with their parents. So I think it's in terms of thinking outside of the box, decreasing retail, maybe converting it to residential. We have a residential problem in here. And we're really going to be asked to tighten our belts as spending over the next few years, because I think we're headed into a long-term protracted recession. We were due for one, and I think it's going to last much longer than people are anticipating.
Wow. Good stuff, man. This is fantastic. I really appreciate your help. I'll ask you one more question, which is an open question, a softball that you can answer whichever way you want. Whether it's related to, I see these themes that run through everything that you've done, and it's really public service. It's really community first and those types of things, which I appreciate and which I think that we can actually learn a great deal from. But whether it's in one of those areas or whether it's in something that ties all of these things together, for the listener, what would be the one thing that you would want listeners to carry away from, when you're encouraging people in terms of giving them advice about saying, here's a way for you to be a solid, supportive citizen. Here's a way for you to get involved. Here's a way for you to really be part of the solution and not part of the problem, even if your complaint is valid. What would you want a citizen to take away from you and what you do that maybe may help them help all of us?
I would say stay informed and don't let apathy creep into your life. And I mean informed. I think a lot of times people get their headlines through the Facebook articles or through social media articles. Sure. I would say diversify your media, get off the phone. It's good to go back to the old school print media and just sit down and really digest information. Right. I don't think people are really talking about how, especially this generation of people, born in the later 90s and the 2000s, they've always been online, always have had smartphones. I think that's dangerous to our democracy. I think people really need to take a step back and be like Henry David Thoreau and really step back and really wrestle with what's happening in society. And you can do that by taking digital detoxes, really getting involved in like I said, diversify your information sources. Don't just get everything from Fox News, MSNBC. Get multiple information sources, even international information sources. You see stories that are happening in America. And don't let apathy creep into your life. I think people are really passionate about the federal races, but when you move on down to the state and the local level, it's like, okay, who's your district council person? Get to know those people. Get to know the projects that are coming in your community. Get to know the funding allocation. I think COVID has really brought that to people's attention in terms of there's certain cities that had mask ordinances early before the governor implemented it. Certain cities declined them. Certain cities have rental assistance programs. Certain cities have ignored that. Other cities like Paris, for instance, we implemented an eviction moratorium until the governor's orders are lifted. Other cities do not have that. So I think it's important to know how your city is helping out the residents, how your city is helping out businesses. And it starts by not being apathetic and getting information sources beyond that little Facebook clip, that Facebook headline, really wrestling with information and really taking time to really digest information and digest what's happening in society. So that's my thing, is really don't be apathetic and don't be stupid. Be informed.
Wow. Great, man. From your military service to your service on city council and your service all day, every day as DA, David, you let us know a great example of how it ought to happen for us all. And thank you so much for coming on and taking time with us, man. We appreciate your service, and I appreciate you as a friend and as a representative of the best of us. So thank you so much, David. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for having me, Joe. I really thank you for inviting me to your show. I appreciate it as well.
Thank you. David Rabb was absolutely fantastic. there's a couple things that come through for me on this interview. First of all, he has a theme in his life of service, whether it's the military, whether it's serving on the city council, or whether it's serving as a DA. Listen, let's keep it real. He went to Stanford Law. He doesn't have to work at the DA's office if he doesn't want to. He could be in the big firm. He could be doing a whole lot of different things, and he could be living somewhere other than Paris. He went back to his community. And so he's a community guy. His theme is service everywhere. I love how he is informed by his experience, and he will tell you so, and he is objective at the same time. I think that interviews like this make me hopeful because he's an excellent gatekeeper for justice. That's the kind of DA that you want. That's the kind of lawyer that you want. Remember, lawyers are officers of the court that are supposed to uphold certain standards regardless of where we work. He also reminds us that, comparisons might be inevitable just because I interviewed a public defender as well. But we show that we can be different people with common themes. And so he's done some very important things. I would imagine that his best contributions are yet to come. I think that he's got it all, got all the bells and whistles, and does good work, has the right heart, and he's reminding us to be informed about things. We're smart enough to look for information and find information, but the good news is the bad news. If we use the ease of technology to not question the information that we receive or to just get it the easy way, then perhaps we're not as informed as we need to be. I'm always reminded of how technologically proficient we are, how easy it is for us to be in touch with each other, but how little we actually communicate. Just ask your son or daughter how many of the people, the hundreds of people that they follow on Instagram and who follow them, how many of them they actually talk to. Actually doing the work to find information, to find nuance in issues. We can't just put all the good guys in one bucket and all the bad guys in the other. There is nuance and there is context for things. And if we really want to move society forward, we have to do that work in whatever we endeavor, whether we're talking about race relations, whether we're talking about criminal justice, whether we're talking about priorities in city government. We really have to do that work, and that work never stops. But we are glad that we get to be part of it here on the Joe Speak podcast. So I thank David Rabb. Hopefully you guys had a lot of fun. Follow us at Joe Speak on all of the internet platforms, all of the social media platforms, and our show is available everywhere where podcasts are available. Google Podcasts. You can follow our YouTube page, which is Joe Speak Podcast. You can follow us at iHeartRadio. We're out there. So tell a friend. We're trying to give people good information. We're trying to inform more than politicize. And we're trying to move us forward one day and one show at a time. So until then, we will see you soon. Look both ways before you cross the street. You take your time leaving, but hurry back. Joe Richardson, Joe Speak Podcast. We out.